You won't believe what happened inside a cozy little cafe tucked away in a quiet American town. What started off as an ordinary afternoon turned into a jaw-dropping moment, one that would soon ripple far beyond the four walls of that coffee shop. The scent of fresh ground coffee filled the air. A few locals sat scattered around the cafe, some reading newspapers, others chatting over lattes. The atmosphere was warm and peaceful. Then the bell above the door chimed gently. In walked Elijah Matthews, a tall, dignified black man in his late 60s. He wore a weathered army green jacket, the patches and pins on it still gleaming with pride. His walk was slow but steady. Every Thursday, Elijah stopped by this cafe. The staff knew his order: black coffee, no sugar, one oatmeal cookie. He always left a tip and a kind word. But this Thursday was different. As Elijah walked toward the counter, he passed a woman sitting alone by the window. She was older, maybe in her 70s, dressed in a floral blouse with her purse clutched tightly in her lap. She watched Elijah with narrowed eyes, a cold, disapproving glare that lingered just a second too long. Elijah, ever polite, gave a small nod as he passed. She muttered something under her breath, low, but not low enough. He paused. "Excuse me, ma'am," he asked, his tone respectful but curious. The cafe suddenly went quiet. And then, she said it, loud and clear. "Go back to the jungle where you came from." Time stopped. You could have heard a pin drop. A spoon clattered into a saucer in the background, but no one moved. No one said a word. Conversations that had been lighthearted just seconds ago were now dead silent. People stared, some at the woman, others at Elijah. A few looked down at their phones awkwardly, hoping to avoid being part of the confrontation. Others looked like they were ready to intervene. The barista behind the counter froze, her mouth half open in shock. A couple sitting near the door exchanged nervous glances. Elijah stood still. For a second, it seemed like he might walk away or maybe raise his voice in anger. After all, what she said wasn't just racist, it was a deep insult, a disgusting phrase that dripped with hatred and ignorance, and directed at a man who had clearly lived through battles far worse than ignorant insults. But Elijah didn't move. He looked at the woman, not with rage, but with something deeper. Calm, steady. His eyes, once young and fierce on battlefields across the world, now held a wisdom that comes only with age and hardship. He had seen war. He had faced enemy fire. He had held brothers in his arms as they took their final breaths, not caring what color their skin was, only that they were family. And now, here he was being told to go back to the jungle, in the very country he'd risked his life to protect. There was a beat of silence, so long, it felt like time was stretching. No one could guess what Elijah would say next. Some expected shouting. Some expected him to just leave. Some even expected him to cry. But no one expected what actually happened next. Because Elijah's response wasn't loud, angry, or defensive. It was something far more powerful. And it would soon leave everyone in that cafe, and millions around the world, absolutely speechless. Before we get to what Elijah said in that unforgettable moment, you need to understand who this man really was. Because his response didn't come from pride or ego, it came from something far deeper: character. His name was Sergeant Elijah Matthews, a name known and respected by many in the town, not because he demanded attention, but because he earned it. Elijah was a retired U.S. Army veteran, having served 3 combat tours overseas, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. He wasn't just another soldier. He was the kind of man who ran toward danger so others could run away from it. He'd been deployed to war zones filled with heat, fear, and chaos, and returned home with more than just scars. He brought back stories of heroism, of loss, of brotherhood. He had received several honors during his service, but the most notable was the Bronze Star for bravery, awarded after he shielded a wounded medic during an enemy ambush. He didn't speak much about that day, but those who knew him said it was classic Elijah, always putting others first. But Elijah's service didn't end when he hung up his uniform. In civilian life, he became a pillar of the community. He started a local mentorship program for young boys, especially those without fathers, teaching discipline, responsibility, and respect. He volunteered every Saturday at a homeless shelter downtown. On holidays, he made sure no veteran in the area went without a hot meal. To the folks in his town, Elijah wasn't just a veteran. He was a symbol of quiet strength and unwavering compassion. He was the man who still stood up straight during the national anthem, hand over heart, eyes focused. The man who always said, "Thank you," to the bus driver. Who tipped waiters well, no matter how bad the service. Who remembered birthdays, lent a hand with groceries, and called everyone sir or ma'am, no matter their age. He was humble to the point of invisibility, but once you spoke with him, you never forgot him. That's why what happened in that cafe felt so wrong on so many levels. When Elijah entered that cafe on that Thursday afternoon, wearing his faded army jacket and that warm, familiar smile, no one expected trouble. He was simply there for his usual, a black coffee, one oatmeal cookie, and maybe a moment of peace. But instead, he was met with hatred. From across the room, an elderly woman gave him a cold glare. And when he passed by her table, she said it, the words that made the air go still. "Go back to the jungle where you came from." The words rang out like a slap. It wasn't just racist, it was absurd, because Elijah didn't come from a jungle. He came from here. He was born and raised in this very country. He fought for this country. He bled for this country. He had done more for America in 1 year of service than most people do in a lifetime. So imagine the audacity, a woman who knew nothing about him, reducing his entire life, service, and humanity to a hateful slur. To her, he was just a color, just a target. But Elijah? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call her names. He didn't cause a scene, because that's not who he was. He stood still, looked her in the eyes, and with the patience of a man who'd seen the worst the world had to offer, he prepared to say something that would shake the room. And what he said next, no one was prepared for. The tension inside the cafe was thick enough to cut with a knife. People sat frozen, cups mid-air, eyes wide, conversations halted. Even the barista behind the counter looked like she might speak up. She shifted anxiously, her hand resting on the register, brows furrowed in disbelief. But before anyone could intervene, Elijah raised one hand gently, signaling her and everyone else to stay calm. He wasn't angry. His face didn't twist in rage. His voice didn't rise. Instead, he turned slowly to face the woman who had just told him to go back to the jungle. He stood tall, not just with posture, but with purpose, like a man who had been through far worse and had nothing to prove. And then, with a voice that was calm, strong, and deliberate, he said, "Ma'am, the jungle you're talking about? I've been in worse places for this country. I've dodged bullets and landmines to protect the freedoms you enjoy today, including your freedom to insult me." The cafe held its breath. The woman, still seated, still holding her tea, blinked rapidly. She opened her mouth slightly, but said nothing. Her smug expression was gone. In its place was a kind of confusion, maybe even embarrassment. But Elijah wasn't done. He took a slow step forward, not threatening, just present, unshaken. "When I was crawling through mud overseas, I wasn't thinking about skin color. I wasn't worried about where a man came from, what his politics were, or who he prayed to. I was thinking about the soldier next to me. Black, white, Latino, it didn't matter. We were brothers. We were Americans. We had each other's backs." A low murmur passed through the room. Some people nodded. A woman near the front touched her chest, visibly moved. Elijah's eyes scanned the room now, not in anger, but in reflection. A few customers had pulled out their phones, recording what was happening. It didn't matter to him. He hadn't come here to perform. But his words, his presence, demanded attention. And then, with a quiet sigh that carried the weight of experience, he added, "Hatred like this? It doesn't scare me. I've faced enemies with rifles. I've heard bombs explode yard from where I was sleeping. What scares me is that some Americans are still fighting the wrong war. A war of skin, of stereotypes, of ignorance." His voice cracked ever so slightly, not from weakness but from depth, from pain he rarely shared. "It's easy to hate. It's harder to understand. And ma'am, I don't hate you. I just feel sorry that no one ever taught you better. Then he stepped back and said no more. And for a moment, no one else did either. The silence in the cafe stretched long and heavy. Eyes were wide, mouths hung open. Some looked down, ashamed. Others stared at Elijah like they'd just seen something sacred. And then the sound of a single clap. A man near the back had stood up. He clapped again and again. Soon, the entire cafe joined in. The sound grew, louder, stronger, full of emotion. Applause echoed off the walls. A standing ovation, not for drama, but for dignity. Someone whispered, "That's a real American." Another voice said, "That man just taught us all a lesson." The woman who had spoken the hateful words didn't say another thing. She looked around, swallowed hard, then gathered her things and quickly walked out the door, silently, with her head down. But Elijah? He just nodded, smiled softly at the barista, and walked up to the counter. "Black coffee," he said, "and one oatmeal cookie," as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that room knew something had. The cafe was still echoing with applause when the woman, who just moments ago had barked a racist insult, finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of what she'd done. Her posture had changed. The smug expression was gone. Now she looked unsettled, as if the room itself had turned against her, because in many ways it had. Her voice came out shaky, barely audible. I didn't mean it that way," she muttered, eyes darting around the cafe. She tried to look innocent, confused, even wounded. But it wasn't working, because the damage was already done, and the crowd wasn't buying it. A man sitting near the window, a mechanic known around town, still in his work overalls, shook his head and said firmly, "If you didn't mean it, you wouldn't have said it." There was no yelling, no chaos, just a growing sense of accountability, like the room had decided enough was enough. Before the woman could offer another excuse, a young woman, maybe in her 20s, rose from her seat. She walked straight up to Elijah. Everyone's eyes followed her. She stood in front of him for a moment, then placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "Thank you for your service," she said, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. Elijah looked at her, his eyes soft, humbled. He nodded, giving her a smile that was full of appreciation but also humility. He wasn't looking for praise, but he received it with grace. And that one gesture opened the floodgates. One by one, people began to approach him. An elderly couple walked up first. The woman gave him a hug. The man shook his hand and said, "My brother served in Vietnam. He would have been proud to meet you." Then came a teenage boy, barely 15, with braces and wide, emotional eyes. He stepped forward slowly and said, "Sir, I want to be like you when I grow up." Elijah chuckled softly and replied, "Be better than me, son. That's the goal." The boy smiled, then turned back to his parents, who were now wiping away tears. Others lined up behind them. People who moments ago were strangers were now eager to shake his hand, offer words of thanks, or simply stand in the presence of someone who carried both courage and composure. No one was asking for photos. It wasn't about clout. It was about respect. Elijah stood there, patient and kind, responding to each gesture with a nod, a word, a handshake. His presence was magnetic, not because he sought attention, but because his dignity demanded it. And through all this, the woman who had started it all sat frozen at her table. She looked small now, not physically, but emotionally, like the power she thought she had vanished, drained by truth and grace. She glanced around the cafe, realizing no one was coming to her defense. Not one person. Even those who might have silently agreed with her before were now dead silent, ashamed, perhaps, or simply exposed. Slowly, she reached for her purse. Her hands trembled slightly. She stood up, not making eye contact with anyone. Her head lowered, shoulders hunched, she walked toward the exit with quick, stiff steps. No parting words, no apology, just silence. And as she left, the bell above the door jingled again. This time, not as a cheerful welcome, but as the sound of hate exiting the room. Elijah didn't turn to watch her go. He was still focused on the people around him, their faces, their warmth, their humanity. And maybe, deep down, he was hoping that even she had heard something that would stay with her. Maybe not today, Maybe not tomorrow, but someday. Someone in the cafe had been recording the entire exchange on their phone, not with the intent to shame, but because they sensed something powerful was happening, something real. And they were right. Within hours, the video was uploaded to social media. At first, it circulated locally, a few hundred views, then a few thousand. But by the next morning, it had exploded. Millions of people watched as a calm, composed black veteran stood face to face with blatant racism and didn't respond with rage, but with wisdom, dignity, and strength. It was the kind of moment that couldn't be scripted. It didn't rely on special effects or dramatic music. It was just one man telling the truth with a voice that cut deeper than hate ever could. The video was reposted by news outlets, celebrities, educators, and influencers. It hit every major platform: Instagram, TikTok, X, formerly Twitter, and Facebook. Hashtags like hashtag the veteran who silenced hate, hashtag stand like Elijah, and hashtag grace over hate started trending worldwide. People from all walks of life commented, "This man is the definition of strength. I hope my kids grow up learning from people like him." This is what a real American hero looks like. But the impact didn't stop at screens. Schools started calling. Principals wanted Elijah to speak to students about his experiences, about integrity and resilience. Parents sent in letters asking if he could mentor their kids. Teachers showed the video in classrooms, not just in history or civics, but as part of character education. It wasn't just a moment anymore. It was becoming a movement. Elijah was invited to speak at town halls, veteran groups, leadership conferences, and even churches and synagogues. He didn't do it for fame. He did it because, in his words, if a few calm words can shift one heart, it's worth the time. He was given the unofficial title, the veteran who silenced hate. But Elijah never let the attention change him. He still visited the same cafe every Thursday, ordered the same black coffee and oatmeal cookie, and still left a generous tip. He still mentored kids and helped struggling veterans in his community. The only difference was now, the world was watching. During a national interview months later, Elijah was asked how he managed to stay so composed that day, how he resisted anger, how he found the strength to speak from a place of peace instead of pain. He paused for a moment, then replied, "Hate only wins when we act like we're beneath it. But if we rise above, stay calm, and speak truth with courage, we take away its power." That quote was shared over 1 million times. It was printed on posters, turned into memes, stitched onto t-shirts, and even engraved into plaques at a few veteran centers. But for Elijah, it was never about the words. It was about living them. His story became more than a viral clip. It became a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks quietly, calmly, with a strength that comes not from anger, but from knowing who you are. In a world often divided by noise, outrage, and hostility, Elijah Matthews became a symbol of grace under fire. A man who stood not to shame, but to educate. Not to fight back, but to rise above. And in doing so, he showed millions of people that real power doesn't lie in matching hate with more hate, but in choosing dignity over destruction. His voice may have started in a quiet cafe, but its echo traveled across the world.